Hello, and welcome to week 4 of the Make Do Create project. Over the last 3 weeks, we've been taking a look at how to make traditional animation and some animation from across the globe. This week, we're going to add to our list of principles with the 7th and 8th being arcs and secondary action, but that's after we first take a look at how people make stop motion animation. If you've seen any of Wallace and Gromit, Chicken Run, or James and the Giant Peach, you've laid eyes on stop motion animation. While 2 of the aforementioned can also be called claymation, they are made using stop motion. Anything can be made into stop motion, simple everyday objects, people, pets, Lego, puppets, because it's all made the same way. Instead of traditional animation where you're drawing each frame, in stop motion you set up each frame with the objects that you want to animate and take a picture of it. That's where the name comes from. You stop the camera and add a motion. Someone will set up a prop in a position, take a photo, go back, change the position, take a photo, go back, change, and so on. When you put all the pictures together and play them back, you see the subject move. This is a good example of straight ahead animation, by the way. In the case of stop motion, you're entering it into a 3D space, and everything is real in the scene. It almost looks like a miniature movie set because that's exactly what it is. Instead of actors, you have puppets that are made out of all sorts of creative materials, and since they have to hold a pose while getting their photo taken, they all have real skeletons inside made of metal and wires, even soft items like clothes and hair. Some have movable mouths, and some have a whole library of heads to swap from. It's incredibly complex, and it takes a lot of materials and talent to make all of the components together. But if you want to make a stop motion animation at home, I'd say it's one of the quicker methods of animation now that there's instant feedback from our phones and there's basically an app for everything. It's one of those methods that doesn't require you to have amazing drawing skills either. And while in the industry there's a lot of complicated puppeteers, sculptors, and mechanics going into it, you can make stop motion out of just about anything. So this week we're going to make our own stop motion animation. I meant it when I said you can use anything for this. I used a bowl of cereal. I'll talk through how I made this now, and we can get into the week's animation principles as well. I use an app called Stop Motion Studio. This isn't a necessity, as you can just take photos and have them in your camera roll, but this app covers the tricky stuff automatically, so I highly recommend it. This is what the interface looks like. There's a lot of features packed into this app, but I'm just going to be using the bare minimum that we need. If you use the Flip the Clip app for the 2D animation, you'll recognize the timeline at the bottom and it works the same way. So let's start. Very simply set up like a regular camera, and the red button on the right is the shutter. That's what you're going to be using the most here. Once you take a photo, it gets added to the timeline below. I just set up the stage for this using an empty table and placing all the bits and pieces in the center of the frame, and one by one having them pop in one after the other. You can see at the bottom there that the pictures are being added in. The pouring of the cereal is where some useful holding tools would have come in handy. I just had to make sure that you couldn't see my hand at the side of the frame. If this was happening in a real film studio and a character or object was suspended in the air like this, they'll have an arm type tool planted to the set floor and connected to the character to hold them up, but then they'd have to edit it out digitally after. Remember to check the frames that you've done to make sure you're happy with them and see if it makes sense. You can do this by scrolling through the timeline at the bottom. Now I took away the box here, but I wanted to get one more picture with it, and I needed to check that I put it back in the right spot. So on the left hand side, if you scroll up and down, it shows you the onion skinning or ghost version for the last 3 frames. You can use this to check the movement fluidity. It's pretty handy and pretty cool, a feature to have in this app. let's talk about the first animation principle we're going to cover today. This principle is called arcs, and it's a rule that helps guide us with movement and what looks natural. The principle of arcs is one that observes that most movements follow a circular path or an arcing motion when moving in almost any direction. An example would be someone swinging a baseball bat. Throughout the entire motion, a bat will travel both up and down and side to side, but it will follow an arc while doing this. When you're doing it in real life, you don't really even think about it, it's just that natural. Even a bullet exiting the barrel of a gun will have an arc, though you may think it's travelling in a straight line. As with other animation principles that break down motion, few of the places that you won't see this happen would be something like robots or machinery. They would use a very linear straight line motion because they're all mechanical and about precision. So a general rule when using this principle would be, if it's a natural movement, include arcs. And for the cereal pouring out of the bowl, I wanted it to look like a little waterfall effect pouring onto the table before we go out and spell the words. I just used sellotape and I hung it the sticky side up out of the bowl and stuck the cereal pieces to that. If you want to change the frame rate, you can do that by clicking the cog icon just next to the little plus sign. I'm just making this string of tape longer. I only did this for the pouring out part because the tape was sort of too sticky and it was going to be too much hassle to use the tape for all of the pieces. But to get the falling out of the bowl effect, I just made the tape longer than I needed and tucked a lot of it into the bowl and then dragged it down one honey loop at a time for the falling out effect. The next principle today is called secondary action. While the last principle was about movement, you could say this one is more about character. Secondary action is an action that accompanies the main action going on, to put more emphasis, emotion, or meaning behind the first action. Say you have a character making a phone call. The main action is dialing the numbers, but a secondary action could be them squinting, reading the number off some paper, or holding their other hand out in a shushing action towards someone else. Both of these things can tell us a little more about what's going on. Maybe they've never called the number before, or maybe this is a voicemail that they need to hear. The secondary action can be quite small. It doesn't necessarily have to involve the rest of their body or even another prop. It can be as simple as a character giggling as they dial the phone, because maybe it's a prank call. If you think your animation needs something a bit extra, pinpoint what the primary action might be, and then ask, how can I add to this? We've covered all of the tools in this app that we'll be using, and the rest is just laying out the pattern. As I said before, you can do whatever you want. I decided to have the little marching cereal spell out "eat breakfast." And the next part of this is very simple but repetitive. It always helps to have a bit of a formula. So for each new frame, I added 3 or 4 new honey loops to keep the progress consistent, and gradually made the shape of the letters. One tip I have is that if you want to keep the animation from feeling too static on the parts that aren't moving as much, if you move each piece just a little bit to make it look like they're flowing in a stream, if you get me. You see how the honey loops on the tape don't look like they're flowing, but the ones on the table do? That's just because when I was adding the 3 or 4 honey loops to make up the letters, I went and just moved ever so slightly all the rest of the loops as well. And I found this little character in my house on a shelf, so once the word eat was done, I got it to appear behind the bowl and watch the rest of it unfold. As a little cheat, we can use the cereal spilling from the bowl as the top of the K. Just moving the character a tiny bit every few frames so it looks like it's alive and paying attention. When it gets to the end, adding the exclamation mark, I noted that there was 4 falling mid-air pieces at the bowl, so when it got to the last 4 ones that I needed for the final letter, I took those ones at the bowl away to make it look like it finished pouring just in time for it to finish out the letters. And then at the very end, once it's all done, the little dude has watched it all, but he decides it's too early and he's going back to sleep. Once you're happy with it, you can save your video by hitting back on the timeline, which will take you to the main menu if you hit select. You can pick your video and then choose the share option, and there's all these options you can share from, but I'm just going to save it to my device, and that's all there is to it really. This week's film recommendation is Fantastic Mr. Fox. It's a quirky, funny movie with a lot of household names featuring as voice actors. This movie is a culmination of over 125,000 pictures. All of these sets, props, costumes and animals and humans were made by hand, and every little movement was meticulously planned out and done individually. That wraps us up for this week. We've entered into the 3rd dimension on animation with stop motion, and we've covered what it means to add arcs and secondary action to your animations. As always, please share your creations with us and subscribe to the Wheelworks channel so you don't miss out on what's coming up in the future. Thanks, and see you next week.